Thank you, Sherry, and welcome, everyone. I'm excited to present this information to you because clinical trials, as I'm sure you know, are very exciting, complicated, and even intense. And what our intent with this webinar today is to clarify for you our processes and procedures so that you have a better understanding of how we approach clinical trials and how we can be a trusted advisor with you, as well as to highlight some of the actual tools that you're likely to use if you do clinical trials with some of our assessments. So here's what we're going to cover, the processes that I mentioned, and then one of the core issues is when you need a license, it's critical to submit a license request. Even though we can get some preliminary information initially, we actually need that document completed to actually generate a quote that you can rely upon. In clinical trials, one of the things that we find is that often the intensity is related to time deadlines. And so the question becomes, can we expedite this particular clinical trial? We have two ways that we've developed to do that over time. And one of those ways is related to what's called limited permission agreements, and that's associated with an individual trial. Then there's a larger scale way of doing this, which is to have a master license agreement, so an MLA. So we'll talk about each one of those approaches, what are the benefits to you, and how you can use that to facilitate expediting your particular clinical trial. And then we'll step back a little bit from those processes and procedures. We'll talk about Pearson as a world leader in assessments. I'll show you some websites where you can find information about specific Pearson tests and how you can learn about those, as well as how you can find information about which tests have been used in clinical trials. Some pretty interesting websites that you can use to track that information down. Then we're also going to talk about qualifications and rater training. We approach this in a different way than we do in the rest of our business in terms of assessments for Pearson, and I'll explain how we do that. We'll go through some top Pearson assessments that have been used in clinical trials, and then I'll walk through, again, on a highlight level, which assessments, which disorders or diseases. In some ways, those are going to be obvious, but in some ways, they'll be kind of surprising and interesting, I think. So Pearson has made a renewed and deepened commitment to pharma. Part of that is manifested by me being here. That is, Pearson has hired me to be in the role of a business development manager for pharma. So partly I'm going to be reaching out to pharma companies, to contract research organizations or CROs, and help to build that business, but also to facilitate how do we do this, how can we get all the pieces in such a complicated process organized. So what our intent with all of this is to be your trusted partner in terms of clinical trials, and we have a number of experts as far as the staff that we have involved in training, as well as individual people who work on either research or maybe with a particular product, so we can get your questions answered about all those products that we have. We also recently added and trained a contract specialist in our legal department, and that is helping to keep us up to date and to move more rapidly in terms of moving license submissions through the pipeline and getting those done efficiently. Now, we'll continue to evaluate and revise our processes. One of the primary goals that we have is how do we decrease time from application to an executed license. And so part of this involves clear communication to you. Often I may play a role in that. Some of our other staff members will too. And this webinar, again, is a way to help you understand how we approach this. And then we'll walk through the specifics of how to expedite licenses. And then the other piece that we're really adding a renewed focus on is rater training, or another way of talking about rater training is those people who will be administering or scoring the tests. How can we help them to understand the tests and in some cases directly train those people? So here come the processes. So we're going to talk about how Pearson approaches clinical trials. And the first question that is often asked is whether or not for a particular study do you need to purchase a Pearson test or do you need to license a Pearson test? When will you use which process? Because they involve different staff members and different kind of sequences. So the key question is, when is a license required? And the simple answer in terms of that question is, if there is a modification of the test, you're going to need a license. So what are the primary examples of modifications of the test? One would be a need for a translation of the test to a foreign language. Another one would be to put the product into a digital format. And oftentimes, contract research organization will have a proprietary electronic device that they want to put our product onto that device. That is possible, but you need a license to do that. Another way in which a modification is requested is when someone wants to add a header or a footer to either paper or digital administrations. Those are all the examples in which often those require a license. There may be some other possibilities in terms of license being required, but those are the primary ones that we have at this point. Now, what if you're not going to modify the test in any way? Another way I've talked about is to sort of buy the test straight off the shelf. No modifications are needed, no license is needed, then you can buy the test straight off the shelf. Our person to facilitate that is Deborah Vance. So Deborah Vance, you can reach at that contact information on the screen, and she can give you quotes for straight off the shelf Pearson Tests. Now, the reason why it's important for you to access that channel is this will expedite your ability to acquire the test. One of the primary ways in which it expedites the acquisition of the test is that she will not walk through qualification issues. And historically, in terms of how we've handled the qualification issues, has been that we've assumed that those who inquire from Pharma will have the proper qualifications. We do that slightly differently now since I arrived in this role, and I'll explain that to you. But the key point for you as a person who's interested in acquiring our test is if you don't need a modification, she's the person who's going to facilitate this process, and you don't have to go through that qualification issue like would normally happen. So if you do need a license, you have to submit this license request. How do you do that? First, you would go to this landing page. So it's the pearsonclinical.com/pharma-licensing.html. So you go to that page, and then you go down to this tab, Submit a License Request, click on it, and then this will come up, and you will get a license request form in the form of a Word document. You download that, you complete that, and then you attach it to this email address. Now, this email address is going to go to a different staff member that I'm going to tell you about. It's Debrale Graywolf, and I'll give the rest of her information here in a few slides. But anyway, that's who it will go to when you send it this Pharma licensing email address. If you have any questions, you can reach her at this number. You get a hold of her, and you go through that. So to just give a highlight of some of the elements that are included in this license application, the one critical piece to be aware of is captured here with this first arrow, which is that this, once it's completed and our legal department agrees to the terms and the legal department of your company agrees to the terms, it's a legally binding contract. Now, that's important because you can't use our materials in a form other than as published until this agreement has been signed and executed. Now, there are ways to expedite some of the issues related to that, but that's a key piece to be aware of. Now, the additional point to be aware of is that because of the legally binding document or agreement, if you want to make a change to that, you have to make a formal amendment to that. So keep that in mind if you're going to change what you want to do in your study, and you want to be pretty clear about the details of your study before you submit this license application. You see there that the agreement fee is $12,000 plus the cost of material reproductions. Often several copies are required for any particular trial because they're done in many times multiple sites for sure, but also many times multiple countries and a variety of languages. The processing time we've historically quoted, which is still on this document, is presently 6 to 8 weeks. Now, I don't know if you can see this in the bottom of the screen there, but we believe it's been reduced more to about 4 to 6 weeks. Yes, there are ways to expedite that, but in terms of the normal process, when you just submit this without any modifications or any adjustments, that's what we would expect in terms of time frame. Some of the elements that you're going to need to have details hammered out before you submit this trial license application is which tests are you going to use, and often that means which subtests, because many clinical trials do not use an entire test, they just use subtests. How are you going to reproduce the test? Will it be paper copies? Do you need audio? Will it be online, screen administration? Then we also will need to know how many languages and which languages, which countries, which territories. Will you need to modify the record form? Will you need to modify the stimulus book? Will you need an examiner's manual? How many will you need? Will those need to be translated or not? So there's a number of detailed questions that you need to have pinned down before you submit that trial license application, which will allow us to give you a much more accurate estimate. When we've done this without having that completed, we call it a preliminary quote because we know that there are things that aren't accounted for when this form isn't completed. Additional items are things like the number of subjects, the total number of record forms, et cetera, and you get the idea there. as far as the kinds of things we need. And so then you would submit that, and that goes to this particular email, and this is our staff person who is critical to moving you through the licensure process. Her name is Debrale Graywolf. And so she will receive that submission, that license application, and she will respond to you. And again, you can reach her at this phone number to get a hold of her. We have done preliminary quotes. We hesitate to do those because we really want to try to help you get the details clarified before you submit that, because what happens is if you get preliminary quote, of course, many times the details change, and that means that the quote changes. So if you need a quote that you want to have firm and you want to present that to a customer, you'll need to submit that licensing application. So how do we expedite this? What if you want to have this process faster than the 4 to 6 weeks we talked about? One method is the limited permission agreement, which is for individual studies. Another method is the master license agreement. What do each one of those involve? So with the limited permission agreement, what you do is you have a fee of $2,500. And what that allows you to do is to kind of begin to work on your trial without actually administering any tests yet. So you can't administer tests yet, but what you can work on is you can start to work on the translations, you can start to work on the form adaptation prior to the full license. You won't be able to actually administer any tests until the execution of the full license, but oftentimes what holds up the beginning of a trial are these other issues, the preparation for the trial, that is the translations, the headers, the footers, putting things into electronic format, etc. Now, in addition, even if you don't execute the limited permission agreement or ask for that, you can get watermark versions of tests to use in IRB submissions or internal review board submissions, ethics committees, or other kinds of things that are going to help to facilitate your process to a degree. But more likely, the bigger hurdles that you have are translations, most likely. That's the biggest hurdle, and then less so the form adaptation that you may need to do. The way you can get that expedited is through this limited permission agreement. Now, the master license agreement is sort of a different phenomena. What a master license agreement allows you to do is it allows you to set all the legal terms for multiple following clinical trials. The reason why this is critical is when you're just doing a normal individual trial, what we might call a general license agreement, you have to kind of reinvent the legal wheel each time you do a new trial. What happens with the master license agreement is that it may take a little bit longer to execute this agreement because it's more extensive. But once that is executed, what you are then permitted to do is to submit what are called PNFs, or project notification forms. Why does that matter? That matters because PNFs executed, meaning they're completed between our legal department and then submitted back to you within 2 to 4 days versus that normal weeks period of turnaround time for a general license agreement. Obviously, that's a critical factor if you expect as a company, maybe you're a contract research organization yourself, maybe you're a large pharma company that wants to do multiple trials on a particular intervention, and you're going to need to use lots of our tests. In that case, it would make a lot of sense to use the MLA. Now, to give you a little context, historically we've had very few MLAs, and until I kind of came into the picture, we hadn't offered MLAs as a general option. Since I've been here, we've sort of rethought that, and now we are offering these MLAs. Now, the MLA fee, it's a one-time fee for $5,000, and then after that, your individual study fee is $7,500. Now, there are other expenses involved in that, but in terms of just that, you see there's a reduction in terms of what it costs you to do this particular trial. So previously it would have been $12,000 for a standard license. For each individual study or each PNF, it'll be $7,500. So you can do multiple studies for this amount, which is going to be substantially lower than your $12,000. In addition to the fast turnaround time and the fact that you can do multiple studies for less, there are other economic incentives. So there are other issues in terms of individual study fees, content delivery, freezing test costs over time, over a period of time for you, and even reducing amendment fees, which often come up in clinical trials because people want to change what they're doing, add a site, add some subjects, whatever. So anyway, these will help pull us into figuring out all these pieces with you, but also really be focused on a very rapid turnaround time for you, which we know is critical on your end. So I'm going to be one of the point people in terms of facilitating that process of becoming, of doing an MLA. It won't only be me, though. Debrale, Graywolf will be involved, and other staff members are likely to be involved. But it's very important that you're aware of this option, which we did not offer in a general way previously. So the way that we think about it, it's going to be certainly expeditious, because you're going to be able to move through multiple studies in a year or a couple of years. It'll develop long-term relationships with us and you, and we think it's really a win-win for both of us. So beyond what I would consider to be improved processes, and now you know a couple of the critical staff, and I'll repeat those as we go through here, but Pearson is a world leader in assessment. And what I have found is that certainly psychologists, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, there are several professionals who are aware of our tests. But what I also find is that in the clinical trial sector, it isn't always the case that people are aware of our tests. There are some, but there are quite a few that are not aware of our tests. So who is Pearson? Well, Pearson has been involved in the assessment business for over 80 years. And our tests are research-based. They're reliable, valid. They represent the highest technical quality in assessments today. We believe that's true. And we think we have the data to back that up. We have a number of what are considered to be gold standard assessments. Those include tests in cognition or cognitive ability, memory, neuropsychology, behavior, mental health, personality, psychopathology, achievement, speech and language. So we believe that we have some excellent tests that are going to help you to find what you're looking for in terms of a signal indicator as far as a clinical trial that you might do. Now, there are different ways to think about our tests from the vantage point of how we think about them. A psychologist like me thinks about these areas of functioning. So our tests cover some of these areas, but this is not exhaustive. Things like anxiety, academic functioning, ADHD or attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder, cognitive functioning, depression, development, dementia, Alzheimer's, executive functioning, memory, cognitive impairment, and many more. So that's kind of one way that we think about it, or as a psychologist. The way that often in clinical trials is thought about it is in terms of therapeutic areas. So neurology, the central nervous system disorders, psychiatry. Another thing that comes up is there are a number of chronic medical conditions, and these are 3 examples of those, that have comorbid mental health disorders. And depression certainly is the top among those, but there are others. And so our tests become salient for a number of different therapeutic areas. Sometimes you might not be aware of some of those that would be relevant. This is a list of the disorders. So another way to think about it is what is the presenting disorder or disease. So you see in the top there on the middle column, depression, anxiety, PTSD, psychosis. But as you move through, there's a real variety of different types of disorders that our tests have been used with. Parkinson's, cardiovascular disease, MS. Many of these disorders have comorbid cognitive functioning deficits along with mental health deficits. So there's a variety of things that can be relevant to what you might be doing in a particular trial. So that just gives you sort of an overview. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through in sort of a summary way, really, some of our top 11 basically tests in clinical trials. And I'll show you how I found this information or how I generated this, because you can do it yourself. But in terms of depression, the Beck Depression Inventory is the most utilized Pearson test presently in clinical trials. So there have been over 1,008 clinical trials as of that date. Now that really includes, as you see down here, my little caveat here, the asterisk, and you look down here and note, the source of this information was from www.clinicaltrials.gov. And I'll tell you a little about that database further down the webinar. But it really has only been around since about 2000. However, the requirement of many clinical trials, not necessarily all, but many or maybe most, to be listed there really only started in January. So this number of clinical trials for the Beck Depression Inventory is actually probably a notable underestimation of how often they've been used in clinical trials. So I just have some summary points. Obviously, this assesses in terms of overview, depression. I list our qualification levels. I'm going to talk about qualifications here in a few slides. Translations. Now, the interesting thing about translations is I'm going to explain to you how we think about translations and where you can find different information about translations. But some of the translation information is published tests and published translations. And I'll distinguish between that and research translations. The place that you'll find research translations is at this URL. So I'll explain the difference here in a few slides. But I want to go through, in an overview, some of our main tests that it's important that you're aware of if you're not. Beck Anxiety Inventory, 252 trials as of October 2017, measures anxiety levels, and you see some of the information about that, including administration time. BAYLEY, Scales of Infant and Toddler Development, BAYLEY-III. Now, one of the things to be aware of is when you go to clinicaltrials.gov, there are different versions of our tests. So if you search for BAYLEY, you're going to find the most number of tests. But it may, if you search for an individual version of the test, you're going to get fewer actual trials. But what this is going to do is the BAYLEY's is going to examine all facets of a young child's development. So multiple clinical trials, 187 with that test. 175 with a symptom checklist for children. I'm sorry, symptom checklist not for children. So it's going to look at a broad range of psychological problems and symptoms of psychopathology. And you see the age range 13 and up. This is a similar type of test, brief symptom inventory. And these are basically rank ordered in terms of the number of clinical trials based upon the tool that I used, that I talked about. Provides patient-reported data to help support clinical decision-making and intake in the course of treatment in multiple settings. The Vineland is pretty popular in clinical trials, 132 clinical trials. Overview measures adaptive behavior from birth to adulthood. Often the Vineland is used in studies with autistic children and children who are mentally handicapped. You see the age range there. Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scales, there's really a wide range of different trials that have been done with this, 87. So it's a measure of cognitive ability, and it's one of the gold standards out there from our portfolio. California Verbal Learning Test, 86 clinical trials since October. It's an assessment of verbal learning and memory deficits in adults. Repeatable battery for the assessment of neurological status update. So it's going to provide you with a brief individual battery that gives you indicators of cognitive decline or improvement across these domains: immediate memory, visual spatial, construction, language, attention, and delayed memory. One of the interesting things about this particular test is there are 4 different forms, A through D, which is very important in clinical trials because often they want to test rapidly over a comparatively shorter period of time. The different forms of the test allow you to do that. Many translations of that test. I'll give you an example of the number of translations. Wechsler Memory Scale, 4th edition. So this is going to be a test, as you see here, for adults. It's going to be focused on, obviously, memory. It's one of the most advanced measures in terms of memory that you're going to be able to find out there. Wechsler Intelligence Scales for Children, another one of our gold standard tests. 52 clinical trials as of October. It's going to measure children's intellectual ability. We tend to call these our Wechsler family of tests. And so that gives you just kind of an overview of some of the tests. I'm going to come back to some of the tests and list off interesting disorders that are affiliated or associated with the use of those tests. But where do you find information about our tests? So one place that you go to is this website, www.pearsonclinical.com. And what you can do there is you can find out information about product details, resources, training information, frequently asked questions. So you can get an overview of some of our tests there. Then, in terms of learning more about the pharma piece of this puzzle, we have a pharma landing page, which is pearsonclinical.com/pharma-licensing. That, as I showed you earlier, is where you can find the license request form that you can submit. But on this page is also where you're going to find languages, and I'm going to show you how you do that here in a few slides. So when you go to this pharma landing page, what you would do is you would go down to here, we call it content and translation. So content is actually the test. So maybe we'll change the name of that. But anyway, it's the tests and the translations. And so it's going to show you a number of our frequently used products in the context of clinical trials on that link. So there are 3 ways to access the translations of our tests. One is you can go to this page that they mentioned, but the extension there is content dash and dash translations. So that is where you're going to find many of our research translations. So I'll define that in a couple slides. But it's possible that it may not be exhaustive, and so you would have to confirm with Debrale Graywolf at this email if that is an exhaustive list or not. Another way you can find translations is it may have been published by another Pearson entity in the world in another country possibly, maybe in the UK or another country. Deborah Graywolf will be able to advise you on that. If that is the case and you want to use one of those tests, you would purchase that directly from them, not from us, and you would not need a license to do that. Now, the third possibility is you may want to commission a translation of one of our tests. So what is involved to do that? First of all, you have to submit a request for a license. So you need a license to be able to do that. And then you have to have an entity that translates our test, and they must provide to you a certificate of language validity. And then you need to submit that to us. And then once it's completed, the translation is completed, you also have to submit the translation to us, and it becomes our intellectual property. So those are the three ways to access tests. Now, the other thing that I would mention to you that I didn't include on here is if you go to just pearsonclinical.com and you search through for tests, you'll find our published tests with published, if there are any alternate languages in that section. So that's the other way. So here's where I'm going to kind of clarify those issues for you. One is the issue of a published translation, and that's one that you would find under Pearson Clinical. If you're able to find the test there, you can use that test as is, but we don't allow customers to translate those tests that are in that particular language. So if it's a published translation, you cannot translate the test. The research translations that you find at this pearsonclinical.com with the Pharma suffix after that, if you find a language but you want to translate it in that same language, for some reason you could do that. But you also can translate any language that you don't find. So Debrale Graywolf is going to be our point person on that. So here's one example of this issue in terms of available languages. So when you go to the Beck Depression Inventory and you search for that, you will find other languages on that pearson.clinical.com website in Spanish. So that would be considered the published translation, that version of the test in Spanish. However, if you go to the Pharma website, what you're going to find are many more research translations that if you so choose, you could use one of those research translations as well. Or if you wanted to add languages, you could do that if you follow the sequence that we just described. So those are really the ways you're going to find what are languages and what would you need to do to be able to access those. Now, this website that's pretty interesting, I think you probably have already heard of it, clinicaltrials.gov. If you go there, you can find what Pearson tests have been used with what types of diseases or disorders. This website was developed as a result of the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act of 1997, and that required the United States Department of Health and Human Services through the National Institute of Health to start to register or provide online clinical trials or registration of clinical trials for both federal and privately funded trials. I don't want to dig super deep into some of that stuff, but that website became available in February of 2000. If you dig deeper, what you're going to find is that it really only started to require that trials be published there in January of 2017. Now, the other thing that you're going to find when you go to that website, so I'm going to show you what it looks like here. This is that website, what it's going to look like. So you can search by a number of factors: disease, condition, other terms, country. If you hit the advanced search, you can actually search for outcome measures. That's where you put in a Pearson measure. You can search by other factors that you want to look at. One of the things to be aware of is many clinical trials, the initial trials are registered, and often in the United States and even other places in the world, the initial registration is required, but the results aren't always required. So you may not find the results there. But you're going to find our Pearson test. That would be one way to find that. So then another issue that comes up is this issue of rater qualification and rater training. And so, as I pointed out, the straight off-the-shelf process expedites your purchase of the test. But we realize that there are, since I've been sort of on the scene in this role, that there are situations in which raters really don't have the level of training to administer or score the test. And we want to make sure that you're aware that we can provide training to do that. And we've been doing that previously. We expect to be doing that even more, and more recently we've been doing it quite a bit more. So we have the capability to certify trainers once they meet our criteria for a specific tool. Now, in terms of those tests, I'm going to show you a summary of those tests. As we walked through those, if you looked quickly, you saw that there were different qualification levels, a B or a C, at least in terms of the ones that we showed you. The qualification B at its core requires a master's degree. You see a number of different areas of study for that master's degree. There are a number of different ORs, or other ways that you can meet this qualification criteria. You are certified by one of these professional organizations. Oftentimes that's going to require a master's degree anyway, or it likely does, as well as a license to practice in that healthcare field. So at core, really, you're looking at sort of a master's degree level with some caveat to that as you walk through that. And then with the qualification C level, to purchase Pearson Tests, so for our general population of people that purchase our test, you'd have to have a doctoral degree to be able to purchase at a level of C. Now, even though we don't require that of pharma, and historically we have not required that, we've operated on the assumption that raters would already meet that, my experience has been that sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. So to give you an idea, when you look through some of our tests, there's certain credentialing trends that you see. So, for example, with tests that are more like checklists or symptom inventories, like some of these tests here and some of the tests down here, they're more at this level of really a credential level B in terms of the normal qualifications. And then when you look at these other assessments that are more particularly focused on cognitive functioning or ability or arguably learning, some of those are going to be at our level of a C qualification. So how could you, let's say that you have raters that you want to make sure that they're meeting that criteria or they get some training. Now, there's some training that if you go to our PearsonClinical.com website, you'll be able to find some training there under the training tab as you look at an individual test. So you can find some information there. Sometimes there's recorded webinars, live webinars, PDFs of webinars. So there's a range of existing online sources of training. However, we expect that there are going to be cases, and we have cases right now that are ongoing and even other cases that are planned, where we expect that you're going to need some training. Now, some pharma situations already have trainers on staff who are at that level C that may be required to administer certain tests, and they're going to train people to appropriately administer the tests. But you also may need training, and that's when these different options can come into play. We can provide face-to-face investigator meetings that we go to a site to meet your raters, and we train them there. We can do live webinars where instead of going face-to-face, maybe logistics prevent that, and you want to do it live, but you can't do it in Hong Kong, so you're going to do it in the United States, and you're going to do it on a webinar. Also, we have found that consultation is a rather useful option to have during the ongoing course of a clinical trial, and so we can offer that. We can also record webinars, and we have two different kind of formats generally that webinars are accessible. Recorded webinars are accessible. One is the Pearson Clinical Training Campus.net. I'll show you some of that. Another option is sort of BrainShark. Now, the way we've done this historically is we have a service agreement in which we will quote fees, and we go through a process of finalizing that. It's possible that we may change that to include service agreements with our licensing agreements, but we haven't made that change yet, but it's something that we're considering. So in terms of the pearsonClinical.trainingcampus.net, you can go here and you can look at some of the training that's available. This way of training is going to require that you submit, and then it will get confirmed, your education and training. So you're going to need your license number, your degree, et cetera, to be able to access that kind of training. Here are some of the examples of the training that's available through that method: Beck Depression Inventory, Risk-V, and you see the title of that particular training segment, and you see some others here. Now, what you might need, and we expect is often the case, is you may need specific training that addresses modules on a specific administration of an individual test. That is going to be different than what we have right here. And BrainShark is the platform that we use to provide that, and that's how we would deliver that to you. And we could discuss what that would be involved in that. Now, when there's additional training that's involved right now, as I mentioned, we go through this process where we essentially negotiate a services agreement. And the key person in terms of that is going to be my colleague, Adam Scheller. So he's a psychologist also, and you see his contact information here. Often what happens is I become sort of the point person in facilitating that with Adam. That will sometimes involve some of our training team staff to consult with them. Maybe it involves other research staff that are familiar with our test. It just kind of all depends. But we work through that process together. And then I'm going to kind of end with kind of some highlights of which assessments and which disorders. So which assessments have been used with which disorders. We're just going to walk through that because I think it's pretty interesting. And so the way I did this was I went to that clinicaltrials.gov site, and I searched for our test. And basically, I essentially